So the talkies are called the talkies because all they do is talk. And the movies are called the movies because they also, it's interesting, right? I mean, it was only recently pointed out to me, and it's the sort of fact that just made me feel so dumb. Like, how did I not know this already? Isn't it also interesting how since movies became like a thing, violence has generally been a lot more permissible on screen than sex, right? Like, I get there's always been porn. And if you haven't seen it, I honestly urge you to go and watch some of that early black and white porn. It is kind of hilarious. But I mean, in mainstream public release movies, violence has always been a lot more acceptable than sex, right? Since the Lumiere brothers did their first public projected motion picture screening in Paris, December 28th in 1895, Westerns were one of the earliest and still are like one of the most common genres. Like, it's a whole genre that's typified by iconography like guns and showdowns and saloons and robberies and sheriffs,
with huge themes like good versus evil, civilization versus wilderness, law versus chaos.
But saying that violence is a lot more prominent than sex in mainstream movies, well, that's kind of, I mean, like, duh, because art has always been created to reflect the realities of the creator and of the ultimate consumer. And the USA back then, well, it was pretty violent. Like, I mean,
It still kind of is.
but life in the US in the early 1900s or late 1800s, or at least prominent in the living memory of those alive at the time, was a life that was pretty rugged, pretty frontiery, pretty untamed, at least if films are anything to go by. And America is still a really young country. It's only 248 years old as of this filming.
I went to a school older than that.
Anywho,
Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy really opened up my eyes to how violent everything was in the States back then. And just putting aside the question of whether it actually was that violent, what Blood Meridian made me think of is how we can still see that violent hangover in our cultures today, like how we're all still tussling, as different cultures, generally speaking, with questions around violence and sex and like the role of religion as a guiding moral framework. In this video, the three things I'm going to talk about are what the violence in Blood Meridian is like, 2, the effect Cormac McCarthy's writing creates, because it really does create an effect, and 3, how the book made me reconsider as a whole
Literature
and
literary critique.
so there's no proper title. This is just a no spoiler review of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian or The Evening Redness in the West. But don't worry. This is not going to be some thesis-y examination of violence and sex and religion on our lives in the 21st century. I thought that was just a really interesting jumping off point because Blood Meridian is so
violent.
And it's not just in the what happens during the violent scenes of Blood Meridian that is violent, but it's also the way in which the violence is written, like the way Cormac McCarthy writes, that makes the violence so startling. So, very quickly, overview time. Cormac McCarthy, who unfortunately died in 2023 at the age of 89, was an American novelist, an American playwright and screenwriter, and he is pretty much seen as one of the most powerful and influential of contemporary American writers. And his stuff explores, generally speaking, the human condition in the face of violence and survival, and his stories are typically set against the American South, against a lot of Western landscapes, like The Road with Aragorn, son of Arathorn, or No Country for Old Men. Yeah, like you kind of get the picture of what his stuff is like, right? And so Blood Meridian roughly follows this character called the Kid, and it's in a series of episodic encounters as he, the Kid, leaves home at the age of 16. He gets into some juvenile scrapes like getting shot. He joins a gang that makes money scalping natives. He breaks away from this gang, he does his own thing for a bit, and eventually, let's just say he settles down. And throughout, the kid is coming to terms with his life, with life in general, and questions of, like what it means to be alive.
And
That is a big theme that McCarthy explores in Blood Meridian. Like, how do we live with ourselves in a world with
So much violence.
the two other main characters are Judge Holden, who is kind of like Mr. Kurtz, but more fleshed out and still somehow mysterious.
And he's a giant albino.
Plus, there's a guy called Glanton. So, the violence. Let's talk about the violence. You know how Quentin Tarantino's violence, it looks a certain way, right? Like it's graphic, but it's stylized. There's a sense of humor to it, like obviously dark humor, but there's humor to his violence too. There's even like levels of irony to his violence, right? So it's not just violence. It's like the violence is communicating something other than just being shocking or gratuitous. And no doubt it is shocking and gratuitous, but his violence communicates more than just that. Like I find it pays homage to film at large, and especially to the films that paved the way for his film to be made. But ultimately, there's a overall and palpable good-naturedness to Tarantino's movies, right? To Tarantino's violence. But can you imagine what it would be like if that good-naturedness was replaced by,
Like a mean-spiritedness.
like, the violence isn't an homage to cinema, but imagine that the ultimate purpose of the violence, instead of just looking cool or visually a certain way, which is the main purpose, because I mean, it's cinema, it's the movies, they move. But imagine the violence that you're seeing. Imagine that it's not an homage, but it's simply there to shock you and ick you. First, to look a certain way, but ultimately just to shock you, just to ick you. No good-natured homage to cinema through the violence, just mean-spirited desire to gross you out. The filmmaker just wants to make you feel sick. And you can sort of imagine him making this face while he films it or watches you watch it. It's mean-spirited. But even a mean-spirited lens, as unpleasant as it is, there's still a subtext to it, right? We can still ask, why does the filmmaker want to do this? There's still
commentary
in the mean-spiritedness. You know what I mean? There's a moral point of view, because the mean-spiritedness, at the very least, has to acknowledge the fact that these acts are gross and inappropriate, right? It just so happens that the mean-spiritedness exploits it at your expense, as opposed to, say, pay homage to something like Tarantino does for your benefit. But now, imagine the violence with no mean-spiritedness, no good-naturedness, with just
Absolutely no commentary.
violence with no moral point of view to present it. Just violence as reality. Just as the sun rises and sun sets. It's not there to ick you. It's just there. Violent, raw, unadulterated, meaningless.
Why is it so violent? I don't know.
It's just violent. It's just what it is. It's there.
You happen to get icked by it just existing. That's just reality. There's nothing beyond it. Isn't that terrifying? That is how Cormac McCarthy writes his violence. Not to mention, the violent acts themselves are fucking insane, and they're frequent. So yeah, the violence is presented as just that.
As violence.
No commentary. It's just
Violent.
And McCarthy does that by writing in a very idiosyncratic style. Like the language is archaic, it's dense, it's lyrical, it's even poetic, but also it's stark and it's bare with minimal use of punctuation, using words as they would have occurred to the characters inside the book. And the sentences are so long, and it gives the writing like a mythical, biblical feel. Like, check this out. When Glanton and his chiefs swung back through the village, people were running out under the horses' hooves, and the horses were plunging, and some of the men were moving on foot amongst the huts with torches and dragging victims out, slathered and dripping with blood, hacking at the dying and decapitating those who knelt for mercy. There were in the camp a number of Mexican slaves, and these ran forth calling out in Spanish and were brained or shot. And one of the Delawares emerged from the smoke with a naked infant dangling in each hand and squatted at a ring of midden stones and swung them by the heels, each in turn, and bashed their heads against the stones so that the brains burst forth through the fontanelle in a bloody spew, and humans on fire came shrieking forth like berserkers, and the riders hacked them down with their enormous knives, and a young woman ran up and embraced the bloodied forefeet of Glanton's warhorse. Yeah, so pretty violent. And Blood Meridian, it doesn't follow a traditional narrative structure. Instead, it's episodic, and it spans a huge geography. Like the kid and the scalping gang, they trek all throughout America. And in terms of time, Blood Meridian also spans years, maybe even decades. And the language, as you just saw, is barely punctuated. Instead, the story seems to be punctuated by violence. And violence is just presented as violence, just that, no commentary or subtext. The effect of Blood Meridian, the effect of reading it, is like a fever dream. It's like, what the hell is happening? Where am I? And then suddenly violence, 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 violence. And then you're in a different place, and it's snow and not desert, and it's forest and not ocean. And it's the same thing again. Violence, violence, violence for years. It's disorientating. Plus, then there's this character, I mentioned him already, Judge Holden. Like, is he the antagonist?
I don't know.
He's super philosophical though. And just generally speaking, an awesome character.
But what the hell even is he?
And so, like, amongst everything, interspersed amongst everything, all of the traveling and the hunger and the pain, the same thing but somewhere else, and in and amongst all the violence, are these like philosophical passages that just completely tilted me even more. Because now there's this character, the judge, who is justifying, explaining all of the violence and all of the war to me. Like, what the hell am I even reading here? And I know I have to read this book again and again and again, because there was just, I could see there was so much more for me to discover in the writing. Like, I kind of saw this whole world I could have jumped into when I first read it. But I remember holding my mind back because I didn't want to get lost there. This book is just amazing. So amazing that the experience of reading it really made me re-examine what I thought of when I say literature, and also made me think about people who do critique literature. And so sadly, I'm gonna have to be briefest here because this is the most difficult bit to put into words. I have read so many great books this year. And part of the reason for the existence of this channel is that I want to communicate, I want to share how awesome it's been reading those books. But I've never really felt a need to justify or defend what it is that I'm thinking or whatever. You know, because the main purpose is basically transmit the enthusiasm I have for the books. And so to make my point about literary criticism, is it just an academic or highly educated and formalized way of saying, I like this book or I don't like this book? Literary boo-hurrah theory.
Like, for instance,
I like this book because when I read it, I saw how it made allusions to Moby Dick or Candide or the Iliad, and they are great books. And it also made allusions to the Bible and Shakespeare is a great writer. And I know about them, and clearly the author knows about them. So I am smart, and this is my smart defense of
Liking this book.
is that fair?
I don't know, like, did the writer really give that much meaning to the words? Or did they just write reality as truthfully as they could, and we, the reader, find these deeper meanings? And literary critics are so educated that they make even more of these links that are just more clever.
I don't know.
And finally, to my point about how Blood Meridian made me re-examine literature as a whole, let's look at the word evening as a demonstration that points towards what I want to say about re-examining literature. because I really can't language it. And I'm going to be a little bit of a literary critic here. Blood Meridian, or the Evening Redness in the West. That's the full title. Evening, like evening before night, evening of the day, the evening of the day, like the day is evening out. It was like this, hot, loud, tiring, and busy, but now it's evening. It's evening. It's mellowing. And evening redness in the West. Sun sets in the West. The red sun is sinking in the West. The sun becomes even, spreads out over the horizon, flattens out, disappears to black. Red is also blood. And there, in the West where we're headed, in our future, where we are manifesting destiny, is blood. And the blood is evening.
It's becoming even
Flattening out and spreading.
everywhere.
The destiny we manifest, our future, is one of blood everywhere. Bye, subscribe, love.